these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Not too long ago, in early June, June 7th to be exact, I got the honor of jumping out of an airplane into Normandy, France, just over Mont Saint-Michel, and a static line jump in a World War II paratrooper outfit out of the C-47, just like our forefathers did. I think even the static line cable that you hook up your static line chute to in the airplane was an original from D-Day itself. A lot of the planes that fly over during that week are original planes, so of course with updated, engines and whatnot. So it was a really cool experience. My first time in Normandy, 80th anniversary, really special. President Biden was there. President Macron was there. A lot of dignitaries. One of the last D-Day events where we might see actual World War II veterans who were there on D-Day, as of course, many of them are in their hundreds at this point. So really special. I've never been, and I think it probably affected me more than I thought it would. I'm not an emotional guy, but and I'm not sure it affected me emotionally. I just think it had a profound impact on geez, I don't know, an appreciation for, first of all, the tactics of storming that beach. I can't help as a SEAL but think of the tactics in a case like this. I didn't know how vast the difference was, for instance, between low tide and high tide on the beaches of Normandy, whether any of them, whether it's Omaha, Utah, what have you. Massive difference, not something you usually see in the US, meaning that if they chose low tide, which they did choose, and they had reasons for that, that you had to pass through about 800 meters of wet, soggy sand through machine gun fire before you even got to the extra horrible location that you had to then pursue, which was basically a hilltop. I mean, for lack of a better word, it was there's cliffs in Normandy, France, and then there's steep, sandy hills. It's one or the other. So you can either scale the cliffs as the Rangers famously did in Pont de Hoc, or you can storm the well embedded what would you call them? German turrets from the low ground. It's a tactical nightmare and that's coming from a guy who knows what we call OTBs pretty well, over the beach landing. So it's one of our specialties, right? How do we get onto a beach and take it to the enemy? But amphibious landings where they know you're coming, a little bit different. And I think there's a newfound appreciation for that. Why they choose low tide? Because that would reveal the many barriers, water obstacles on the sand that the Germans had in place. If they got over high tide, the boats would likely hit those. So they had to choose low tide and then just rush the beach. The reason D-Day is important is because, to me, it's sort of a defining moment in history. There's a before and after D-Day. There's a world before and there's a world after. And the world before is one basically characterized by global conflict all the time, big countries involving small countries, or big powers invading small powers just because they want to. I mean, they can, and they want to take their stuff. That's, I think, the simplest way to explain it. And then there's the post-World War II era where America rules and, grabs everybody by the scruff of their neck and says, you don't get to fight, and there's going to be trade and stuff, and everyone's going to just cooperate. And if you don't like it, too bad, we've got all the nukes. So, did I sum that up okay? Dr. Hal Brands is with us today, somebody who actually speaks intelligently about this stuff instead of like a knuckle-dragging snake eater. Dr. Hal Brands. Hal, thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So, fellow at AEI, professor at Johns Hopkins, got his doctorate from Yale, no big deal. Also had served as special assistant to the Secretary of Defense for strategic planning in 2015, 2016. So, you know your stuff. What do you react to what I just said? What do you think about D-Day. Is that an accurate point in history to be making that kind of an assessment, or would you place it somewhere else?
No, I think I'd make two observations, which I think line up pretty closely with what you were saying. The first is that it's hard to overstate just how much different the post-1945 world is from the pre-1945 world. The pre-1945 world had seen the global order fall apart twice in the space of about a generation. And the cost of that collapse, or those collapses, was about 80 or 85 million lives, all in, when you add the two world wars together. The post-45 era, it hasn't been a picnic, but there haven't been great power wars. There haven't been global depressions. Human rights and democracy are more widespread and more widely respected than they ever were in the past. It's been, in comparative terms, a golden age for people in a lot of different places around the globe. And the critical factor has been American leadership. But the second point, and this connects directly to what you're talking about with respect to sort of the tactical nightmare and then kind of the larger strategic problem set of how do you fight your way back into a Europe that has been conquered by hostile powers, this is the perfect illustration of why it's so important that the U.S. remain engaged overseas. Because no matter how hard it seems to, counter what Russia's doing in Ukraine or push back against Chinese influence in the Western Pacific, it's a lot harder and a lot costlier to do that once you've been thrown out of these regions and you got to fight your way back in under the most appalling possible circumstances.
Yeah, and what do you say to people who are like, whose argument back to you would just be, well, why do we have to fight our way back in? Why does it even matter?
Well, I think what we've learned a few times throughout our history is that even when we try to just sort of let the world sort itself out, two things happen. One, the world doesn't sort itself out. And so the alternative to a world structured by American leadership is not a peaceful, prosperous, democratic world where the U.S. just does its own thing. It's the hellscape that emerged a couple of times over the first half of the 20th century. And the second thing is, even if that doesn't bother you, the reality is that, that those tensions, those disturbances, they reach out and they touch the United States eventually. There were very few people in the United States who wanted to get involved in World War II in September 1939 when it started. There were very few Americans who wanted to get involved in World War I when it started in August 1914. What happened in both cases was that we found that, aggression has a tendency to become contagious, and it spreads geographically. And so whether that manifested in German submarines sinking American ships or ships with Americans on board and interfering with American trade, or whether it was the way in which Japan responded to a number of our policies by ultimately attacking Pearl Harbor, even a country as blessed geographically and geopolitically as the United States is not an island. And we won't be able to insulate ourselves from trouble overseas forever.
Yeah. That's there's definitely a sense of utopianism and idealism that infects the thinking of a lot of people. Also, I think maybe another thing to add, maybe talk about this, is what about the global economics of it? Because even if you dismiss your argument about a chaotic world eventually coming to our shores, even though it's happened in the past, people will still dismiss that. They'll say, we're far too powerful for anyone to even think of that. We have nuclear weapons. We didn't before. Okay, fine. They also suggest that there's this world where supply chains can be totally remade and you can still have all the same stuff, the same price that you want. Even if China and Russia sort of begin to control the global economy. So how does that work out? And also maybe let's describe the evolution of the global economy since from the first half of the 20th century to the second half, and why that matters so much. Then we can get into a deeper conversation on globalization, I suppose.
Yeah, let me give an example from World War I, and then I'll bring it forward to the present. So in World War I, what ultimately pulled the U.S. into that war was the fact that I mentioned before, which is that, Germany was pursuing a form of warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare, that led to the deaths of Americans and the sinking of American ships crossing the Atlantic. And the question is like, okay, well, why were those ships crossing the Atlantic? And the reason was that unless the only way the U.S. could have stayed entirely out of World War I not been implicated in any way, was to basically cease its trade with Europe altogether. And Americans, for very good reason, were not willing to do that, because that would have led to a collapse of the American economy, and it would have led to more Americans becoming impoverished and a lot of economic consequences that would have come home to us and hurt us in a very significant way. You can make the same point about what would happen if you had an Asia dominated by China today. So if you have an Asia in which China becomes the dominant power and the US is kicked out of that region, and the US no longer has alliances with Japan and Australia and South Korea and a bunch of other countries, that is not going to be a region that the United States can trade with freely. It's not going to be a place where Americans can invest freely, because China is going to dominate the economic relationships with those areas. And you can bet that China is going to use its coercive leverage to impede Americans' access to supply chains of really important things like semiconductors, 92% of which, at least the most advanced types, are made in Taiwan. And so there will be a material impact on American prosperity if the US is not able to keep these regions free and conducive to US involvement. And if anything, it's become worse than it was back in Woodrow Wilson's day, because the type of interdependence we have now is so much deeper and more complex than it was before World War I. Before World War I, you had very high levels of trade, but goods were usually manufactured in one country and then sent to another. Now you've got high levels of trade, but goods may be manufactured in 5, 6, 7 different countries as part of these long, intricate supply chains that have developed really over the past 5 decades or so. And so it's hard to even specify how severe the damage of the US being, say, locked out of East Asia would be, because there are goods that may have sort of their final assembly done in the United States that are dependent on components that come from Vietnam or Taiwan or Japan or other places like that. And so the supply chain impacts of having your access denied to a very important region would start to manifest in ways that I don't think we can even really fully imagine right now.
That's true. And it also makes the politics of it more difficult, because that's a really good point. Back in the day, there was a lot of trade, but it was like, we make cheese and you make the widget, and then we trade the widget for the cheese. Now it's highly complex supply chains. I mean, this microphone that I'm talking to you on, I don't think you can really do like plastic injection molding here in the US, but I'm pretty sure that the polymers that were used in the plastic injection came from Houston and then went overseas and then came back in a different format. And then, maybe the metal was probably mined somewhere in South America. I mean, who knows? Nobody knows. Nobody knows how to make anything. Like, there's a lot of people that know how to make a lot of really little tiny things that all come together in this sort of amazing global economy and supply chains, which we hear more and more, I think, from our kind of populist left and right, that are bad things that we could, if we just had the willpower, replace them with, a purely American manufacturing process, but nobody seems to know how. And it makes the politics difficult, because you can't say, look, you won't have X, Y, and Z. Now, it might be accurate to say you just won't have much of anything, or everything's going to be vastly more expensive, which means in the case of some products, you just won't have it, because once it hits a certain price point, the consumer just won't buy it. And so, if you want your children to have anything remotely close to the lifestyle that you enjoy today, then you got to retool your thinking. So do we just suffer from a severe lack of understanding of basic civics and global economics? Because I think that's at the heart of the problem. I've realized that I'm trying to, justify what I thought was an easily justifiable vote for, say, giving Ukrainians some bullets to fight the Russians so that we don't have to.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think there's an even bigger piece, which is that, the catastrophic success of the US-led international system, or Pax Americana, or whatever you want to call it, is that it has been so effective in making the world a relatively decent place to live in that we have kind of forgotten how nasty the world gets when it's not structured by American leadership. And so
Right.
You mentioned, and this is entirely appropriate, 80th anniversary of D-Day is a really big deal because it may be, these are typically done in kind of 5-year increments, maybe the last one where we have living veterans, which means that basically everybody who is alive, not everybody is, the vast majority of people who are alive today have no living memory of what happens when the world really does fall apart in the way that it used to fall apart with some frequency prior to 1945. And so that just makes it hard for Americans in particular to understand how ugly things can get in geopolitical terms, how ugly things can get in geoeconomic terms. It makes it hard for us to understand that democracy is not the default setting in human political arrangements. It actually only flourishes when it has the support of a really important actor like the United States. And so we've essentially forgotten what the world is really like in its natural state. And I think that helps to explain why Americans sort of understandably sometimes get a little bit frustrated with the burdens of our current approach to foreign policy.
Yeah, it feels like a burden. It feels like we're the one who spends all the money. And to an extent, I mean, some of these arguments are perfectly valid. I brought them up to our European counterparts saying, look, I mean, don't you guys feel kind of shitty that you yourself, just by yourselves, you can't just defend yourself against one country, Russia? Like, that should make you feel shitty. As a man, that would make me feel shitty. It should make you feel shitty. I've told them that, and it's true. At the same time, it doesn't, two things can be true at once. Our involvement has to give them that backbone that they need, and two, they need to invest more in some basic military equipment. And then there's free, and Americans get frustrated too by like your obvious free riders. Switzerland sure is nice in Switzerland, right? I mean, and it sure is nice to have this like this sort of fake neutrality that they enjoy.
Yeah.
It frustrates people. I get that, but I'm like, look, I'd love to write a fiction novel about a different world. That's just not the one we live in, though. We got to deal with the cards we're dealt.
Yeah, you sometimes want to say to officials in neutral countries, boy, it must be nice to have the option of neutrality in a world where non-neutral countries keep really bad actors at bay, right? Try being neutral, in a Europe that is ruled by Hitler, or in an Asia that is ruled by the PRC. Like it's just not going to happen. And I think one of the positive impacts of the Ukraine war is that it shook up that thinking a little bit. And so Sweden and Finland were never really neutral. I mean, they were Western aligned, US aligned.
I agree. I didn't mention them for a reason.
Had a formal neutrality for perfectly understandable reasons, and both of them decided to get rid of it after Putin invaded Ukraine. That he sort of made their strategic choice for them because they realized, and to their credit, they acted on the realization that they were going to need a closer tie to the West and to the transatlantic alliance and to the United States to make it in this more vicious world that's starting to reemerge.
I think it's also hard for people to understand China and Russia's thinking, because hell, it's hard for me to understand it because from a very Western point of view, from a very pragmatic Western point of view, and especially American point of view, where we really don't have that much history, so we don't have a whole lot of burden, right? We don't, and you can see this when you travel to different parts of the world, how I don't even know how to describe it, how people's history sort of lives within them. And you can kind of tell. It's interesting. Even if they don't know it that well, even if they're misinformed about it, it sort of lives in the culture for these countries that have been around for 1,000 years or more. And America's just not like that. So we don't have like a chip on our shoulder like so many do. So it's hard for us to understand anything, but I think kind of your rank pragmatism, because from our point of view, if Russia and China just sort of played by the rules, they would be better off. Everything would just be better off. And so for the populists, they think that way. They think, okay, well, they can't be crazy, so we're the problem, right? And then this sort of self-blame mechanism starts occurring where, we provoked them, or we were unfair to them, or X, Y, and Z. What do you make of that? And what is Russia and China's thinking?
Well, what the phenomenon you mentioned is exactly why so many people, particularly in Europe, but but not just in Europe, had a hard time believing that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, even after, the US government had been shouting from the rooftops for 3 or 4 months that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. Because if you look at it from kind of an Enlightenment perspective, if you think that history is a story of progress, then this makes no sense, because it was going to be this horribly bloody, catastrophic endeavor so that Russia could control a swath of territory on the map that a lot of Americans, have probably never heard of before, because it's several thousand miles away. And I think we miss a couple of things that are important in shaping the mindset of leaders in Russia and China. Because you're right that in sort of a traditional security sense, Russia and China actually benefit from the US-led international order. Like what country has benefited more from an open global trading system and secure sea lanes than China has, as it has grown by leaps and bounds over the past 4 or 5 decades. And yet, for some reason, they don't seem to like the way that the world works. And I think there are 2 things going on here. The first is that countries don't just want security. They also want glory and greatness and the privileges of empire. And one of the things that the US alliance system does is it prevents Russia and China from attaining that, because it prevents them from successfully coercing or invading their neighbors. And so when people point out that Russia didn't like NATO expansion in the 1990s and after, you're like, yeah, that's the point, right? Because NATO expansion made it harder for them to do this, right? To do what they are doing to Ukraine today and other places, either in the former Soviet Union or in Eastern Europe. And the second thing we miss is that it would be different if you had democratically elected leaders sitting in Moscow and Beijing, but you don't. You have people who sit atop very repressive, dictatorial political systems. And those leaders really don't like living in a world that is led by a democratic superpower, because they worry that the values that America represents are a lethal threat to their own regime. And it's not necessarily because of anything that the US government does. Simply the existence of thriving free societies, many of which are either American or allied to the United States around the world, that itself presents a threat to their regimes, because there's the constant risk that their citizens are going to say, well, why can't we have that as well? And so there's a certain degree to which Russian and Chinese hostility to the US-led international order is sort of baked into the nature of those regimes.
Yeah, it's like part of their psyche. Again, it's part of the fact that they sort of live within their own history. They both have long histories, of greatness, falling and rising. And I think that plays more of a part than we give it credit for. You've written about globalization's golden age. So what is that? And then let's talk about, like, I guess the pros and cons of globalization as it's seen today.
Sure. So the period I was referring to is basically the period from, let's say, kind of 1989 or 1991 up to maybe 2008 and the global financial crisis. And it was a golden age because the geopolitical barriers to trade and investment were lower than they have ever had been before, right? The Berlin Wall comes down, the Warsaw Pact falls apart, the Soviet Union falls apart. We seem to be moving towards a more politically, diplomatically integrated world. And so if you wanted to trade or invest in China or in Eastern Europe or in India or in any other place, there had really never been a better time, at least in anybody's living memory, in which to do that. And so this was great. It was great for big multinationals. It was also great, at least in certain ways, for ordinary people, because you got the lower costs that came from, having goods that were produced in Sri Lanka or Vietnam or China. Now, there were some downsides to that as well, right? Because the fact that there were lower labor costs available in places other than the United States probably accentuated the trend toward exporting certain US manufacturing jobs, even though there's sort of a much bigger story behind the decline of manufacturing employment in the United States. But that was kind of the golden age of globalization. And the other,
I think the biggest part about the negatives is when it does impact, it impacts like one town.
Yeah.
So it's very, very visible in like in a very real way. And I think that's worth noting.
The losses are always more concentrated than the gains, right? And so if you're able to buy that polo shirt for $3 less than you would pay otherwise because of globalization, you may or may not, realize that. But if you lose your job, right, because the factory closes and it moves to Mexico or China or wherever, like, of course you're going to notice that. It's going to have a profound impact on your family. The last thing just to mention on this is the other thing that made it sort of a golden age was that there didn't seem to be a lot of geopolitical dilemmas associated with investing or trading with places like China, because the thinking at the time was do more business with China. That will accelerate China's integration into the world order as a responsible stakeholder. Maybe it'll even promote political liberalization in China, so you didn't have to feel bad about doing business with a dictatorship. And some of those hopes I think were overstated, if not a little bit naive. But that certainly was the mindset of the 1990s and early 2000s.
Yeah. And what were some mistakes that we maybe? So I think it's maybe commonly suggested now that we went from a sort of golden age where there was a clear ultimate superpower. We were coming out of the end of the Cold War. China had not begun its rise, so to speak. And we have certainly emerged into a more multipolar world with blocks forming, kind of an East versus West thing, kind of. But you've got Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia. Might be missing a couple, but those are the significant ones that, and it's not obvious what ties them together, except sort of what you mentioned before, which was just a desire to be able to do whatever the F they want to less powerful others, whoever that, maybe it's their own people. Like, I mean, Venezuela just had an election that was probably a BS election. Like, not, I don't think we should recognize that as a real election. I don't have the news in front of me, but I'm pretty sure Maduro supposedly won. You can correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't think anybody trusts the results of that. So that certainly is a driving force. What mistakes did we make? Is there anything that we could have done differently in the last 30 years that would have created a different outcome? It's a little hard to tell in hindsight, but maybe you got something for me.
I think everybody has their own list of things they wish the U.S. had done differently. I mean, some people wish the U.S. hadn't expanded NATO into Eastern Europe. I'm not part of that camp. I think that was actually a good and prudent move, and we're seeing the benefits of it even today. But as you mentioned, a lot of people either on sort of the progressive left or kind of the nationalist right have a different view of that. There are some who would say that the big mistake was the response to 9/11 and particularly the war in Iraq. Again, I think that, the rationale for that conflict is misunderstood, and it is more understandable in hindsight than it is sometimes portrayed, even if, on benefit, I think there's a good argument to be had. On net, I think there's a good argument to have as to whether the benefits outweighed the costs. I think the one that people probably focus on the most, which is perhaps the most interesting to talk about, is whether the U.S. should have handled its China policy differently, and whether the U.S. Should have done something different than what it did, which was basically try to hasten China's economic development, hasten its integration into the world economy in the hopes that this would make China a responsible stakeholder. Now, as we saw in the event, it led to something else. It led to a more prosperous China that was also more assertive and quite autocratic. I don't think the problem here was that the policy was tried. It's hard for me to see a plausible scenario where the U.S. doesn't pursue some form of economic integration with China during the 1990s. I think the problem was that the policy persisted for about 15 years after it had passed its sell-by date. And so, there was an instinct back at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration to move towards a posture of strategic competition with China, and then 9/11 happens and the U.S. focuses on other things for understandable reasons for a while. Then the global financial crisis happens, and so that throws the U.S. for a loop strategically as well. And so by the time we really started focusing on the problem around 2016, 2017, we had lost about 15 years that it's hard to get back in strategic terms.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems about right. I mean, it just letting them cheat, not taking them to task at the World Trade Organization, things like that. And now we're sort of playing catch up. What do you think about China's economy, though? I mean, there's different schools of thought on this, that they're actually sort of a house of cards in a way, paper tiger. You know, their demographics are terrible. That's undeniable. They're over leveraged. They finance quite a bit, and it's not clear that they keep really accurate records that they report to the world. So, I mean, what's your take on strategic economic competition?
They have real problems. You know, if you just look at sort of the Chinese annual rate of growth, you know, back in the early 2000s, it would regularly be above 10% annually. And then after the financial crisis, it goes down into sort of high single digits, 7-8%, about, you know, 6 or 7% on the eve of COVID. And coming out of COVID, it's been significantly less than that. And that's the official growth rate, which is certainly inflated. And so what that tells you is that there is a deeper set of economic pathologies than anything that was caused by COVID, right? And so it's a combination of, you know, the debt bubble, the fact that the economic reform movement has been stalled and going in reverse for about 2 decades now. The political system is becoming more hostile to innovation and economic reform as Xi Jinping tries to centralize power and exert control over new sectors of the economy. The demographics are lousy, as you mentioned. By the end of this century, China's population is probably going to be about half of what it is today. I don't know how much of an impact that's having on the economy right now, but over time, that's going to become a bigger and bigger drag. And so the short version of this is that I think China's got some fairly serious stagnation in its future. And that is, you know, good news from an American perspective. If you're just thinking about sort of a zero-sum competitive mindset, the potential problem is that occasionally revisionist powers, which is just what sort of academics call countries that wish the world worked differently than it does today, sometimes when growth stalls and they become worried about the future, they actually become more aggressive. And we see some signs of that in Chinese foreign policy today.
That's my worry. That's my worry for sure. Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think there's a lot of things the Chinese are showing strength in, certainly on a technological front. Basically by assessing where we haven't invested or where we're underinvested, and then they overinvest in there in order to gain some kind of asymmetric advantage, which is exactly what I would do if I were them. That being said, their foundations are shaky to say the least. But that could make them more aggressive. You might make that argument about Russia invading Ukraine. Maybe they felt like it was their last opportunity to do so. Although their economy is doing okay, and that's actually, maybe you can comment on this. This is one of the complaints we hear in Congress, or that we should be doing a lot more to actually win, or at least break a stalemate or hurt Russia, which I certainly agree with. There's been a lot of too little, too late kind of thinking and strategizing. But one of those is on the sanctions front. Maybe help explain that. Even I can't explain it that well about why exactly we're not hurting them when we literally could. You know, a lot of the components they need to build more weapons of war are part of the global supply chain. They do need the global supply chain in order to build those things. They'll eventually run out of their Soviet era stockpiles. And two is just the oil sanctions and gas sanctions, and how do Europeans play a part in that? What could we be doing better?
I think there are 4 things going on here. If kind of the question is why haven't the sanctions hurt Russia more than they have, which is a legitimate complaint. If you go back to, you know, February and March 2022, people in Washington were talking about how the Russian economy was going to be totally crippled by the sanctions, and you know what we saw is sort of a modest GDP hit, and now the Russian economy is growing again. So four problems, I think. One is just that big economies, and Russia's economy is big, even though it's weak by great power standards, are hard to sanction. They're fairly adaptive. People find workarounds, and so it's always a harder task than you think. The second reason this has proved to be the case is that Russia has gotten very good at sanctions evasion, which is one of the ways it keeps getting Western components. And, when we take apart Russian weapons that are found on the battlefield in Ukraine, we find out that they have a lot of, semiconductors that were designed in the West there and things like that. They've gotten good at that in part through working with other members of this, axis of baddies, Iran in particular. The third piece of it is that I think we underestimated how significantly Russia would just reorient its trade toward Asia and particularly toward China. And, China has become a major source of dual use inputs. So semiconductors, lots of other things that can go in civilian or military goods for Russia. They've absorbed more and more of Russia's trade. They're providing more and more financing. And the US, I think, has been reluctant to really go after the Chinese with secondary sanctions for fear of the disruption that could cause either in the relationship or the global economy. And the last one is the piece you mentioned, which is the oil sanctions. And early on, for better or worse, the US and the Europeans basically decided they were not going to try to take Russian oil off the market because that would have bad impacts on the global economy. What they would try to do is limit the amount of money that Russia could earn from the oil through this price cap. And I think the price cap, for a little while, it worked a little bit better than people thought. But since then, we've found that the Russians have discovered various ways around it. And so the major reason the Russians are able to keep financing the war is that they're able to keep selling oil on the international marketplace.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, is there a path at least to engage in those stronger sanctions? Or are European countries the problem there? I'm not sure I understood that out of your answer.
The Europeans are part of the problem, but we're part of the problem too. I don't think it was the case that the Biden administration was dying to just crush the Russian oil export business and the Europeans wouldn't let us do it. I think the Biden administration didn't particularly want to take Russian oil off of the market either. And so in both Europe and the United States, we sort of decided politically that the threat of economic distress in the West outweighed the gains you would get from being more aggressive and taking Russian energy off the market in the way that the US tried to do with Iran back in 2018 and 2019. And, whether you think that's a good move or a bad move, I think it depends on what you value. I think if we had understood back in, say, early and mid 2022, that this was going to be a long war, that we'd be 2.5 years in with no real theory of victory being advanced at this point, you might have gotten a stronger hearing for people arguing that it was worth risking a little bit more economic distress in the West to turn the screws on Putin a little bit harder.
Yeah, and I wonder too if the Biden administration, because they have conflicting mindsets on this. On the one hand, they want to support Ukraine and hurt Russia. On the other hand, they don't want to fulfill that gap in oil and gas production with U.S. oil and gas production because they're against U.S. oil and gas production. These are conflicting ideologies, and it's been rather frustrating certainly from our perspective, in Congress. We'll see how that. I'm sure that would, at least that element of it, would change drastically under a Trump administration. Curious what you think about how that goes. My personal opinion, I think Trump is often labeled with a sort of isolationist, flair, I guess, but I'm not sure he acted that way as president. Well, I'm sure he didn't even. It's often talked about. It's just it's funny because that far populist right, that America First right, and the far left, they sound exactly the same when it comes to foreign policy, and it's odd to me. It's like everything's our fault. Avoid war at all cost, even if it means subjugation of your interests. It's just a very odd idea, an idealistic and naive thought process. But I don't think Trump actually led that way. Now, which is a running mate who certainly does think that way. But Trump has been very careful never to say, he's never said that, we should bail on Ukraine, for instance. He's never said that. He's been very careful about that. So I'm curious what you think happens from there, or if anything really changes.
Trump is strange in the sense that he is both totally transparent and totally enigmatic at the same time. And so, in a lot of ways, he wears his agenda on his sleeve. But then, when it comes to Ukraine or a variety of other issues, as you know, he sometimes uses these slightly elliptical or careful formulations that I think are meant to leave him some degree of maneuvering room when he actually, if and when he actually comes in and takes the helm again. My view is that some of Trump's instincts probably run fairly close to some of the stuff we see from kind of the harder core America first types on foreign policy. And so I think the former president has been pretty clear that going back for about 3 decades, that he has some fundamental critiques of the U.S. alliance system, for instance. Now, during his first term, I think a lot of times those instincts didn't get fully translated into policy, either because the president thought better of it or because he was persuaded to go in a different direction by people around him. Or maybe, and I think this is the most generous interpretation, he was simply using his critiques of European defense spending in NATO as leverage to try to get the Europeans to do more on behalf of the collective defense. It's a little bit hard to tell even now. I do think Trump governed a little bit more along the lines of his instincts in year 4 of his administration than he did in year 1, because he had a group of people around him in year 4 that more closely reflected some of his core instincts on foreign policy. And so if you think that is likely to be the case in a Trump second term, then it maybe pushes you toward a little bit more concern about where the United States might go. But I think on Ukraine, the reality is that regardless of who is elected in November, I think the U.S. is probably going to start looking for a ceasefire at some point in 2025 or 2026, unless there emerges some more sort of forward-leaning strategy that could plausibly result in a Ukrainian victory. The question has become, how do we wind this conflict down in a way that doesn't fatally compromise an independent Ukraine and fatally compromise U.S. interests in Europe? I think Trump would do it differently than President Trump would do it differently than President Harris might do it. But I think on that issue, there might be a little bit less daylight between the parties' positions than it seems at the moment.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And I mean, I think that's our position now. A ceasefire now would be great. The problem is that ceasefires require 2 parties to actually engage in that ceasefire, and Russia has no incentive to do so. And then they're not going to have an incentive to do so until they feel that their costs are too high. Yeah. Otherwise, I mean, it's just a simple calculation, and part of the delivery of aid and changing of tactics and implementation of harder sanctions is designed to simply push us in that direction. And especially on the oil sanctions front, I think Trump would just be a lot harder on that than for the reasons we explained earlier, because it does require this sort of energy dominance mantra that we Republicans love to yell and scream about because it's a good idea, and it would certainly turn the tides there. So what else are we missing here? Let's wrap this up. What do the next 50 years look like? Are we just stuck with this sort of a costly leadership role? Costly is the best word I can come up with, because cost compared to what, right? But are we stuck in that for the foreseeable future, as we encourage allies to spend more, to do more, to be more, and deal with this sort of block of dictators that seek to upend that order? Is there a better way out? Is that just the life we have to live for now and accept it?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. That's the best way out of this, which is that the role the U.S. plays now, it seems burdensome, it seems costly, it seems tiresome, but compared to what, right? What would be the better approach once you take into account that even if we are successful in getting our allies to spend more on defense, which is something we all should want, if you look at the balance of power in Asia, there's no coalition that can check China absent the participation of the United States. If you look at the Middle East, maybe the Saudis can do more, maybe the Emiratis can do more, and so on and so forth. But that coalition to counter Iran and to counter terrorist groups is going to work better if the US is involved. And you can say the same thing about Europe as well. And so what we should try to do is encourage allies to do more, encourage better burden sharing within a broader context of American leadership. Because I just don't see a whole lot of evidence looking at the history of the last couple hundred years to suggest that if the US tries to hand this role off to somebody else, that we are ultimately going to like the results.
No, I don't think we would. I don't think we would at all. There's a lot of evidence to the contrary. Maybe in another podcast we dive into Iraq. That what you said was interesting, and it's a point I've made before too. That if you bother to take an unemotional look at how we got into the Iraq War, which a lot of people don't bother to do because emotions run supreme in political discussions, you might find that the set of facts that they were dealing with at the time were a little murkier than the set of facts that you're dealing with now in hindsight. And I like to talk about historical events or decision points with some counterfactuals at play. You know, the counterfactual to Ukraine is Russia plows through Ukraine and is on the border of 4 more NATO countries. How is that how does that not suck us into a war quicker? Tell me that one. On Iraq, the counterfactual is, you know, Iran was on track to get a nuclear weapon. You know, they don't like us, but they also wanted to deter Saddam Hussein. And all of a sudden in 2004, they declared they would stop nuclear weapons programs. And so did Libya. I mean, they wouldn't have done that otherwise. You might have a really heavily nuclear armed Middle East in a counterfactual. That's not a crazy counterfactual to have. And I just throw that stuff out there to get people to think a little bit more critically about why we did things that we did, and you know why we have these endless wars. Although worth noting, we did not have any endless wars. Me and my friends had endless wars. I don't know about the rest of everybody else who complains about it online, but I guess that's a different point to make. But I'll give you the last word, and we'll end it there.
I think it's a good point. It's a longer conversation, but I'll just put in a plug for a book that a colleague of mine, Kenneth Pollock at AEI, is writing on the history of U.S. involvement in Iraq, really going back to the 1960s, which I think makes precisely this point, that you got to wrestle with the counterfactuals. What would have happened had the U.S. taken a different approach at one time or another? And I think if you look back at the Iraq decision in particular, we have to bear in mind that the consequences of leaving Saddam Hussein in power would have been pretty ugly. You know, you can decide whether you think that those consequences would have been worse or better than what actually happened, but you got to take that counterfactual seriously.
Yeah. Well, this has been interesting as always. Hal, thank you. Thanks for coming on, and maybe we'll do it again.
Thanks for having me.